All right. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to CSIS. Thank you all for coming on a rainy day. I think, as usual practice, we're going to have other people filtering in these first few minutes, but I think we'll get started so we can keep on schedule. My name is Matthew Goodman. I hold the Simon Chair in Political Economy here at CSIS. And among other things, I'm very interested in developments in the Japanese economy. And so we have a sort of series, ongoing occasional series on Abenomics and Japanese economic developments, of which this is a part. Let me welcome also our online audience. We have a loyal following online. If you are into these things, you can follow us at CSIS with the hashtag CSIS Live. Just a few quick administrative notes. Please set any noisemakers to stun or a silent mode. In the unlikely event of an emergency, obviously we can go back down out those stairs to the main street. There are also emergency exits behind us here, so just follow me and I'll direct you. We will not be taking a break between the two panels today, but there'll be a slight transitional period as we switch microphones over to the second panel, so bear with us. But if you need to leave at any time to use the restrooms are back behind the stage. You go out the glass doors and back around to the right there. So feel free to get up. We will also have a reception, wine and cheese, up on the Sam Nunn Terrace behind us afterwards, so please join us for that. And I think that covers all the introductory stuff. So let me just set the scene by, before I introduce our first panel, by taking you back to April 1990, when I was a young whippersnapper at the U.S. Treasury Department, and I was sitting in a conference room, which many of us have been in the Foreign Ministry at 3 a.m. In April 1990. I can't remember exactly whether it was the third or fourth night in a row of negotiating the so-called Structural Impediments Initiative, which was a big initiative that during the first Bush administration under a couple of different Japanese prime ministers. Pop quiz afterwards, who was the prime minister who launched SII? You know, somebody knows. It's a tough question. And I remember negotiating with a Japanese official, and I can't remember who it was, might have been Yamanouchi-san, I'm not sure, over disclosure requirements, because I was responsible for the Keiretsu Relationships chapter of the SII, and we were trying to get at Keiretsu relationships and related party transactions and shareholder rights to some extent, and we were negotiating really minutia. So I remember one of the provisions was something about the financial statement was normally released in an attachment, and it should be in the main primary documents. I mean, we were getting to very little small details, and I'm not sure what all that achieved. I learned a lot. It was an exciting process. But 25 years later, here we are talking about corporate governance in Japan, and I have been kind of keeping an eye on this over those years, and I've seen in the last couple of years some real new things that have been talked about a long time but seem very interesting to me and different. A corporate governance code now in place, a stewardship code for institutional investors, much more talk about diversity on boards and in management, a new JPX-Nikkei 400 index with ROE, minimum ROE requirements and so forth. So this stuff is interesting and different to me. And what we're doing today is to try to look at that, try and understand what's going on and what, the so what of this. Does this matter? What are the likely implications of this for Japanese companies, for Japanese markets, and for the Japanese economy as a whole, because the performance of the Japanese economy as the third largest in the world matters a lot to the United States. So we're trying to get a handle on all of that. So that's more than enough scene setting. So let me introduce our panel here. To my immediate right is Kanji Yamanouchi, who is the economic minister at the Japanese embassy here in Washington, and as I alluded to, a longtime economic officer in the foreign ministry, and among other things that he's done. And so I'm delighted to have Yamanouchi-san with us today. Next to him is Curtis Milhaupt, who is Parker Professor of Comparative Corporate Law and Fuyo Professor of Japanese Law at Columbia University Law School, a real expert on Japanese corporate governance, among other topics. So delighted to have you, Dr. Milhaupt. And at the very end is Alicia Ogawa, an old friend and colleague in Tokyo from her days working at several investment banks in Tokyo. Remember investment banks? They used to be things that Alicia worked for. So, and she's now director for the program on alternative investments at the Center on Japanese Economy and Business at Columbia University. So we're delighted to have this really terrific group with us today. And I'm just going to wind them up and let them be smart. So I'm going to start with Yamanuchi-san, please.
Thank you very much, Matt. And you just remind me of my younger days. I was a young soldier for the U.S. trade war, and this I never forget. And that was the beginning of my real association with the United States, and it was very amazing things. And today we're talking about Abenomics. And actually, as just Matt mentioned, we're talking about similar things of how corporate should be governed, how the corporate should behave in order to make its profit maximized. Then the thing is, in 25 years ago, when SII era, there was a kind of issue between US and Japan. But today, we're talking about on our own as Abenomics. This is a big difference between now and then. And actually, about 2 years ago, CSIS was holding the event called Abenomics. And I was also invited to the panel 2 years ago. That was more general about first arrow, second arrow, third arrow, possible fourth arrow of Olympic Games or something like that. It was more general. But today, I'm very glad that you made this panel possible. This is more focused on the one specific things of corporate governance. And this is a key element of the third arrow, I would say. Recently, at the occasion of the United Nations, the Prime Minister Abe came to New York, and he made a speech about the Japanese economy and Abenomics and U.S.-Japan Cooperation Alliance in New York City. And he repeatedly mentioned that corporate governance is the key element of Abenomics' third arrow. And many people think this corporate governance would be the key because without spending any tax money, this will be able to exercise influence to change the mindset and also the behavior of the Japanese Japanese companies. You can imagine there is more than 300 trillion yen, which is about $3 trillion. Internal reserve of the Japanese companies. They're just there. The problem is not we don't have money. The problem is we don't use it. So this decision-making process is so important. The corporate governance reform will probably directly affect these things. And if you remember the Econ 101 at the college days, you will take some sort of very introduction of the economics, macroeconomics. And John Maynard Keynes mentioned that the driving force of the economic growth is the investment by the companies. So this is something we really can affect the things. Then the Prime Minister Abe's Abenomics started this corporate governance reform. And actually, as you may know, that this has two vehicles. One is from investors' side. Stewardship Code was established December last year. And June this year, we established was the Corporate Governance Code. The two of these sort of coincide. And the other side of the same coin, it's affecting each other in a positive way to maximize its sort of change the behavior of the corporate. And actually, there are the 5 pillars of the corporate governance code. First is securing the right and equal treatment of shareholders. And this would address the kind of notorious cross-shareholdings. And the company have to explain why they are having this policy-oriented shareholding, cross-holding. So this is one sort of element. The second element is the cooperation with stakeholders. There's a much debate over the company is for who, stakeholders or shareholders. So this kind of balance between stakeholders and shareholders. And the second pillar will address this, the stakeholders. And third element of this corporate governance code is appropriate information disclosure. in order to judge which company is doing what and for what kind of future they have. They need to have the appropriate information. So this third pillar of the government corporate governance code would address this information disclosure. And the fourth pillar is the responsible board of directors. And actually, decision-making body of the company is this board of directors. And the component of the board of directors matters. So this government corporate governance code would recommend that there need to be enough number of the independent outsider directors, not from inside of the company, but from outside. So bring about a new perspective and different angle of how to run the company. And fourth, this is the fourth element. And the fifth pillar of the corporate governance code is dialogue between the company and shareholders. And actually, this is clearly related to the stewardship code. And stewardship, these 5 pillars of the corporate governance code is some very elementary things about the company itself. But from the outside of the company, the biggest influencer is investors. They invest. They decide which company they would invest. So stewardship code is address this importance of the dialogue with the companies. So together with stewardship code and corporate governance code, and now change is starting. And I know that enough sort of skepticism about Abenomics because we have the negative growth in 2 quarters in a row. So some people may think that this would be the recession. I don't think so, but because of that was due to the inventory adjustment. But forget about that. And the thing is, these let me say, we are making the significant progress on this corporate governance reform. The first is more than 2,000 leading Japanese companies adopted this government corporate governance code, which is very good sign because they would behave based upon this corporate governance code. So if you see the change of the component of the board of directors, so 5 years ago, about 60 or 50% of the company had only 50% of the whole the leading companies have the directors from outside. But now, more than 90% of the companies are having the directors from outside, and 87% of them are independent outsider. So that means no influence from the company itself. So it's taking place. And also, if you take a look at the return of equity, it is very famous that the Japanese companies' behavior is very defensive, so their ROE was very low. But this is like in 2013, it was about the 5.8%. But now it's more than 8%. It's close to 9%, 8.5%. So this change is already taking place. And also, if you take a look at the benefit of the company's current the profit, and that is count for more than $500 billion. This is the biggest profit ever. So now the change is taking place. The thing is, just remember, stewardship code was established December last year, so less than 1 year ago. And also this corporate governance code was established only June this year. So it's only 6 months, but we see the change is taking place. And we hope that the change of mindset and the behavior of the Japanese companies will bring more investment. That will lead to the more growth of the Japanese companies. I'll stop here.
Great, thank you. That was a great introduction and overview and sort of background to why this is happening and what's happening. So appreciate it, Yamaguchi-san. Curtis.
Okay, well, thanks, Matt, for having me. I'm delighted to be here and happy to have a chance to talk about a very important aspect of the Abenomics program. We have just a few minutes for the formal program, so I'm going to just kind of give my key takeaways in bullet point fashion. I'll be happy to elaborate. I'm going to organize my comments into positive points, some areas where I'm a little bit skeptical, and then areas where I think more work is needed before we can really expect transformative change in Japanese corporate governance. So on the positive side, I really just reinforce what Yamanouchi-san has said. This is a very comprehensive package of complementary reforms that do work together very well. The Stewardship Code, the Corporate Governance Code, and some changes to the Japanese company law. And I think they really are designed, as Yamanouchi-san said, to change thinking in Japan, thinking about the role of the board of directors, thinking about the role of institutional investors, and I think that we can see some change in that area taking place already. One often hears that the conversation has changed in the Japanese boardroom and between institutional investors and Japanese managers. And I think above all, this is a very powerful signal of the importance that the Abe administration attaches to corporate governance. So those things are all, I think, quite positive. Another interesting point about the reforms is how quickly they were passed. For a very comprehensive set of reforms, on any comparative scale, these were passed with lightning speed. And that leads to my next point, which is why were they passed so quickly? Well, the form that these reforms took is very interesting. The Stewardship Code and the Corporate Governance Code are so-called comply or explain methods. So there's no mandatory rules here, but a company is encouraged to comply with the best practices. If not, they need to explain why they're not complying. Now, this is interesting. I think it's useful in avoiding political stalemate, and I think that accounts for the promptness or rapidity with which they were passed. It also avoids a one-size-fits-all approach to corporate governance. I think many studies have shown that in the general case, the market forces or encourages firms to adopt corporate governance structures that are efficient for them, for their unique circumstances. But here's why I'm cautious. I think there's a substantial body of evidence that suggests that Japanese firms actually are not forced by the market to adopt efficient governance structures. And let me give you three pieces of evidence. One, several studies have shown that the Japanese companies that are the most in need of independent directors, for example, companies that have high free cash flow that could be wasted by management, for example, they are least likely to have independent directors. And conversely, the firms that need them the least are most likely to have them. Secondly, in terms of board structure, Japanese companies now have three different options for board structure. The first option was created about a decade ago, which was a US-style board with committees. Only about 2% of Japanese companies adopted that committee structure. My own research has shown that companies with committees have substantially different compensation packages than traditional Japanese firms, much higher level of performance-based pay. And if we're worried about Japanese profitability, we might think that that's a good thing. Remember, only 2% of Japanese firms have opted into that board structure. Conversely, this new option that was created, which is a company with an audit committee, only been an option for 6 months. Already 275 Japanese companies have adopted it. There's evidence that the number of outsiders on those companies has actually gone down, and I can explain why that would be the case. But again, it seems like it may be a kind of facial compliance or a way to comply with the law without really changing what's happening. Third piece of evidence is, over the last 20 years, ROA of founder firms, that is listed Japanese companies that are still run by a founder, their ROA has been significantly higher than
assets, right?
Return on assets, a standard measure of profitability, and how well management is utilizing its assets has been significantly higher than for other listed firms. The answer seems pretty straightforward. The top managers of founder firms hold a much higher percentage of stock in their companies than do managers of other firms. So if you put this evidence together, I think it suggests that the market is not forcing most Japanese managers to adopt efficient governance structures which would increase their profitability. So that makes me skeptical that this entirely voluntary approach to corporate governance reform actually will be effective. Turning to substance of the reforms, here I think there's a number of things. There are many bright spots, but I think there's some things that need to happen in order to really make these effective. So I think, in order to analyze the effectiveness of the reforms, we have to ask, what's the problem that's being addressed? And I think the principal problem is lack of profitability, hoarding of cash, as Yamanouchi-san earlier referred to. What's the solution of the corporate governance reforms? Well, one of the main solutions is independent directors. Here, the reason I'm skeptical is that no studies have ever shown that independent directors increase firm profitability or firm value. And I think particularly where there isn't really a history of independent directors, there's reason to think that an independent director who's isolated on the board, who's not an expert, who's a generalist, an academic, or a lawyer, or a retired diplomat, is not going to be very effective in increasing profitability. So while I think it's great that there's a discussion in Japan about the need to move from a management board to a monitoring board, I think what's missing is a sense of who are the independent directors that are needed in the Japanese context, and how should they be functioning? I don't hear really any discussion about independent committees of the board. I think this is crucial. In the United States, it's not just independent directors that have had an impact. They operate as a committee, and the committee gives them heft, and it gives them greater independence from the board. So I'd like to see much more discussion starting in Japan about committees of independent directors. And then finally, in terms of what else might be needed, I think really the most crucial point is that Japan needs a much more fluid labor market for senior management. There basically is none currently. And managers need high-powered incentives in order to increase profitability. I'm not suggesting that they need to mimic U.S. corporate governance practices, particularly in the area of corporate governance, where we have, executive compensation, where we have many problems. But the basic point is that there's too much hierarchy in the Japanese boardroom. There's not enough risk-taking, and simply adding independent directors to the board, again, particularly if they're isolated, I don't see that as a solution. So I think these things are needed. I'll just end on a positive note, which is if you look at Japanese corporate law, it is actually more conducive to institutional investor activism than U.S. corporate law, for reasons that I can go into. But there are very many important reasons to think that the table is set for institutional investor activism in Japan. Now it's time for those investors to step up and actually put in place the tools that they've been given.
Okay, fantastic, really rich and lots of food for thought there, and very clear. Thank you, Curtis, really appreciate that. Or Alicia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Yamanuchi and Curtis, for pretty much making all the important points that I would have made.
Sorry.
But let me give try to give a slightly different perspective. I think it is important, Yamanuchi-san talked about the Prime Minister's agenda in corporate governance. And rather than talk about the third arrows, which has become a rather trite and misunderstood and cynical term, I like to think about the Prime Minister's agenda being primarily twofold. One is to restore the political importance of Japan in the world, and the second to revitalize the economy, and that takes care of all three arrows. So what is corporate governance, and what is the role of corporate governance in revitalizing the economy? Corporate governance is, Yamanuchi-san mentioned some of this, but it's an attempt to provide checks and balances on the different actors within the private sector, whether that has to do shareholders, management, government, the community, suppliers. And I looked at a Métis survey, which was taken in 2013, which asked companies, and it was a survey of about 3,000 companies, to name the top three constituencies that they paid the most attention to. And the first three, far and away, were number one was customers. And number two was staff, employees, and number three was suppliers. So the first thing I would say about corporate governance efforts is I think that, as these two previous speakers have mentioned, there's a lot of really hard, good work that's gone in here to this initiative, and there's every reason to suspect that there will be positive changes, but my question is, we should perhaps be careful what we ask for, because this hierarchy of customers, employees, and suppliers is a very sort of central identity of the Japanese culture and society. So, as Yamanuchi-san mentioned, one of the Prime Minister's aims of this agenda is to get those cash balances off the corporate balance sheets and into the economy to contribute to the slaying of the dragon of deflation. The Prime Minister would like to see those cash balances spent in domestic investment, and he would like to see them spent in wage growth. And since I'm the obvious person up here to say this, he would like to also see more women being hired. Good luck with that one. Japanese companies have suffered a reversal of competitiveness in many key manufacturing industries, particularly as we talk about Korea and China, and he would like to see some ground taken back from that. In short, the whole goal of corporate governance is to encourage a more productive distribution of both human and financial capital. There's nothing smaller about the challenge than that. Let me move on and say something about the background and why we're at this point, why this reform was necessary, and what I think some of the challenges are to getting to the next space. Curtis made reference to the fact that legal rights of Japanese shareholders are actually stronger than they are in America, and I'm glad he's up here to explain why that's so, because I'm not sure I understand it all. But so the question is, why haven't they used them if they already exist? I think the key obstacle to the improvement in corporate governance, there are many micro issues which these gentlemen have referred to, and I totally agree with, but I think one of the key obstacles is the system of lifetime employment. And so in big companies which are most in need of corporate governance, we're not talking about small companies, people enter the firm after graduation, they rise up the ranks, and the CEO is only the most senior employee. He is not the visionary. He is not the leader in the way that we define that in other Western countries. When I organize conferences for our research institute at Columbia, I often go to business people or investors and say, so who are the bright, shining, charismatic CEOs in Japan? And people will scratch their heads, and usually they can come up with one name. And maybe it's Mr. Mikitani, and maybe of Rakuten, and maybe it's Mr. Yanai, and then after that, sort of, and it's because this is not the role of the Japanese CEO. Strategic decisions, and part of the problem that I understand from interviewing many independent directors, part of the problem of independent directors issuing any kind of, or exercising any kind of supervisory role over the board of directors is that strategic decisions tend to be taken at mid-level management. Lots of nemawashi occurs, lots of consensus building at middle-level management, and then decisions are presented to the CEO and senior management just to sign off. And so the opportunity to intervene and discuss and question is already passed by the time it comes to the board. So I think that the lifetime employment system is one of the big obstacles to better corporate governance. And you mentioned the problem about the lack of a liquid pool of senior management and CEO potential candidates, and that is also a problem. That is changing to a certain extent. I mean, it's very exciting, actually, that now you have at least half a dozen or so Japanese CEOs who have been CEOs someplace else, and whether it's Mr. Uotani, who came from a Western company to a Japanese company, or people who've moved from one Japanese company to another, it's starting to occur. So as both of these gentlemen covered, there are a ton of both legal initiatives, the Company Act reform, non-legal corporate governance reform, Stewardship Code, Corporate Governance Act or Code, and Stewardship Code, which have been enacted. You have the TSC requirement for outside directors. You have the new index, which Matt referred to, the Nikkei 400, which only includes companies who have reached an ROE target, who have reported operating profit in the black for I forget how many consecutive years, and a minimum ROE target, and who have independent directors. And it's interesting that that has become a kind of status symbol for Japanese companies. So that's a good sign that this is a sort of competition to get into that index. Will it be an effective index? One of the changes that surprised me that nobody up here has mentioned yet is the change of the GPIF, the Government Pension Investment Fund, which is the largest pool of pension money, I think, in the world, which recently embraced an enormous change in asset allocation from more than 65% into JGBs to an enormous allocation into the domestic stock market. And the idea was that they were going to use this new index as a benchmark. And two or three things about this. The first is this was a change that was never really in my view, properly debated in public, and so it's therefore, I think, not really well understood or appreciated. And now that the pension fund has reported a loss on those equity holdings because of the short-term dip in the market, it's going to get ugly. The second thing is the GPIF has so much money. How can they possibly be selective and influence corporate governance when the portfolio is so huge and the amount of money they have to influence is so huge? They are duty-bound to buy companies that have a range of values on the corporate governance scale. So that is another sort of piece of, I don't know what I would call it, white noise in the progress of better corporate governance. Some of the goals of corporate governance are rather contradictory, which is also, I bring this up in the context of, as I said first, be careful what you wish for. I think that the Abe administration is going to quickly, if they really believe in this and they really think it's happening quickly, they're going to have to act very quickly to get in front of this train with some public policy responses, because foreign shareholders now own between 35% and 40% of the Japanese stock market. I have no idea why anybody in Japan would imagine that foreign shareholders want something different in Japan than they want anywhere else in the world, and that is high profitability, which means rationalization of staff. It means rationalization of cost. It means an end to what we Americans who experience horrible levels of service. It implies an end to the incredible levels of service that you get in Japan, or certainly a curtailment thereof. And so with the resulting, the inevitable result, which is increasing income disparity, increasing instability of jobs, I think that if the Abe administration really believes that corporate governance is going to improve and companies are going to be much more carefully focused on profitability, then he needs to get in front of these changes. I mentioned the GPIF, but the other institutions that are coming to the stock market are the Bank of Japan, which owns almost 80% of all the ETFs in issue now. The Nikkei Shimbun newspaper reported that BOJ is now one of the biggest, one of the major shareholders of Fast Retailing, the company that owns Uniqlo, simply because it is such a big part of the index, and the Bank of Japan is buying index funds. There is no disclosure of what the Bank of Japan owns, but the Nikkei reporter told me that if you back out the index weights, the amount that the Bank of Japan owns, that's the result you're going to get. I put it to you that the Bank of Japan is not going to be a good, an active stewardship dialogue with Mr. Yanai. So you have these distortions along the path of better corporate governance and stewardship. I think that I would end by saying that all of these changes are positive, and that the fact that one can't deny is that the genie is out of the bottle. This is now an issue on the table, as Professor Milhaupt correctly said. Both companies have an obligation to disclose. It's not a legal obligation, but certainly they will suffer from reputation. They will suffer from the point of view of their share prices if they do not comply. And shareholders as well now have the right to question, to engage in dialogue. So it's really up to the culture of both of these groups to take the opportunity to ask more of Japanese companies than they have been asked in the past.
Okay, thanks. Well, we've had a great amount of both fact and analysis and opinion, so I think we've got a lot to work with here. Let me just ask a couple questions, and then I want to get the audience involved as well, because you probably have smarter questions than I do. But let me just start with a basic question, especially for a Washington audience. Like, what is the problem? Because on one level, what we see from here is Japan still has great companies that make great products, and it seems as though they're very efficient. They make things that work, and it doesn't seem on the surface to be a problem. What I'm hearing here is the real problem. The essence of the problem is that there's sort of cash hoarding going on, and we need to find a way to get companies to push that cash out. At least that's what I took away as the theme of what is at the core of the problem. And is that true? And if so, it seems like there's a lot of elaborate stuff being set up here, a kind of a Rube Goldberg set of contraptions and things to make that happen. It seems like there must be a simpler way to get, if that's all it's about. So help us understand a little more, another level of sort of what is the problem and what are we trying to fix here. Maybe, I don't know, Yamaguchi-san,
if I may,
if
we go back to very, very basics. So what's the purpose of Abenomics? So the answer is to salvage Japanese economy from deflation, which lasted more than 10 years. That is the sort of the primary goal. Then by doing that, we have to grow. But the thing is that there are two different sort of set of goals. One is the growth, but the other is fiscal consolidation. Because you remember, the Japanese debt accounts for about 200% of our GDPs. So we have to address this one. So two different goals simultaneously. That is the kind of a beauty and challenge of the Abenomics. Therefore, the 3 hours. First hour, the easy monetary policy, which seems to me working in a certain amount. But when it comes to the fiscal policy, we have a limitation because we have a commitment, international commitment to sort of narrow the primary balances. Therefore, there are certain restraints for us to sort of rely on too much fiscal policy. Then it comes to the sort of the effectiveness of the third arrow. But we call in Japanese, Shin Seichou Senraku. That is literally the new strategy for growth. But in the United States, usually they refer as a structural reforms. By its own definition, it may take some time. You never expect the result of the structural reform overnight. So it takes a lot. And when you talk about structural reforms, this structure is not just one thing. There are so many things. We have to address those different things simultaneously. But the beauty of this corporate governance is probably this is a one single sort of element which can sort of symbolize almost everything, and without spending any tax money. Therefore, this is so critical, I think. So, but I would say the change for the sake of change doesn't work. Reform for the sake of reform doesn't work. Those are reform we're trying to do under corporate governance reform, more Abenomics. It's for the sake of making sure that the Japanese economy grow again. Then probably investment by the leading company is a key element. So that then we go back again to this corporate governance reform. And some of them are very practical and accepted by the Japanese people. And I think that will be effective.
Okay, either of you want to, you both touched on it. But.
Well, I think the quick answer to your question about why is it necessary Japanese companies make good things and we see them all over is that after the collapse of the economic bubble at the end of the I call it the 80s, but I suppose it was the 90s. The reaction by Japanese companies was to pay down debt, to shrink, to cut costs, to keep shrinking. And the problem is that this mindset is what's creating the deflation. What the Prime Minister and the FSA is trying to do is to try to get them to take risk again in order to grow. One of the alternatives that was considered and dismissed was putting a tax on retained earnings, the way that's occurred in Taiwan. And that objective was deemed to be too heavy-handed, and I think that was the correct decision. It certainly hasn't worked out that well in the two other countries that I know that it's been implemented. So it's just a way to get companies to come alive. Companies have sort of retreated into this area where their primary function is to keep the status quo, keep their own jobs, particularly if they're management, and to keep the status quo, not to grow, not to go outside, not to take risks, not to try new things. And I think that is the reason why corporate governance has become necessary.
I would just add to that the demographic challenges that Japan faces with a shrinking labor force and aging population. You need to increase productivity, you need to increase the return on assets for the future. So I think it's all of those things.
Okay, so that leads into another question about the sort of human side of this, because in addition to getting people to work harder, you got to get more people working. And I want to start by asking Alicia. You mentioned you focused on lifetime employment as a continued barrier. I thought lifetime employment was dead. I thought that wasn't a major part of the employment structure anymore in Japan. So can you address that in a narrow sense, but also more broadly? So what are the impediments in terms of hiring, firing, flexibility of labor. That seems to me a key to this, is getting people, allowing people to, to change jobs with their pay, their benefits, and their dignity intact, which has been always hard in Japan. And so how's that going, and what more needs to be done?
Well, it's going. It's just not going, I think, in a way that anybody likes to see, where Japan has become, like France and very much like America, a two-tiered labor system, right? So you have big companies. Lifetime employment was only ever a de facto thing at big companies. It was never the case for small companies. So at big companies, you have the key group of people who are still lifetime. But in the overall workforce, it's now almost 70% of the workforce is part-time or contract and so on. And so this is what's contributing to the big increase in income disparity. We do need, I think Mr. Shiozaki has just been able to pass a law. Mm-hmm. Minister of Health and Labor has passed a law which de facto allows you to have temporary employees forever. So you can now have these, and an odd thing, it's probably a good thing. What you want is to have everybody become liquid. You want to sort of destroy this differentiation between lifetime employment and contract or part-time or temporary employment. But as it stands now, it's only those guys who are in the lifetime, and they're all guys pretty much, those guys in the lifetime track who make it to management, and they're clearly going to be not as welcoming to outsiders as they might otherwise be. About outsiders, I would just add a comment to something that Professor Milhaupt said that I thought was very important. The failure of Japanese companies to embrace this three-committee system, which is a sort of U.S. kind of system, right, which has an audit committee, a nomination committee, a compensation committee. I've seen surveys which suggest the reason that Japanese companies largely reject that, you said it was 3%?
About 2%.
2% have this structure, is because they roundly reject the idea of any outsiders have any say on compensation or nomination of senior people. That should be kept to the insiders who are all lifetime employees. So to the degree that that system breaks down, that's all for the better.
Comments or thoughts on the labor questions and
well, I would just
flexibility?
Echo or reinforce what Alicia said, which is I think one of the conundrums here is that Japan's social safety net has been integrally wrapped up with the corporation, and so moving to changing corporate governance means in some levels loosening up the fabric of society. So I think that's the real challenge here, is how to change corporate governance without undermining a lot of what has the fabric of Japanese society.
Okay, I want to let the audience come in, but let me ask one more question, which is, to what extent is this an issue of just the whatever the number is, 200 or 300 top companies in Japan? To what extent does all this apply to other listed companies, unlisted companies, or small and medium-sized enterprises, which seem important to the effort to get growth and more productivity? Are they part of this story too, or does this only apply to the top listed companies?
Well, if I can jump in and I'll try to make a quick comment. I deal with a lot of venture capital people, and sadly, they tell me that one of the obstacles to investing in venture startups in Japan is that largely these founders or owners don't want outside influence. They do not. Even if you're offering Michael Dell as part of your board, as part of your investment, they'd rather not. They'd rather keep control. Now, part of that may be that the venture capitalists themselves are extracting huge profits out of their investment. But nevertheless, there seems to be a resistance on the part of small companies as well to welcoming outsiders.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Otherwise, let me open it up to questions. Please wait for microphones, which I think are here. Yep, Wesley has one there and another one there. And when you ask your question, please identify yourself and then do ask a question. Does anybody want to kick it off? The first one's always the hardest. There we go. Professor Katada. Is that on, Wesley? Okay. We've got another one. Hold on one second. Well, we need it for the online audience. We need to have the microphone, so thanks. There we go. Oh, still not.
And
There we
from,
go.
Oh, okay. Saori Katada from East West Center and USC. I'm not an expert on the corporate governance at all. I enjoyed hearing all your kind of examination of what's going on. But when I observe Japanese society, risk averseness is the kind of the characteristics, and that comes from the incentives put in place from the system. And lifetime employment, even though the amount of who have the lifetime employment is relatively limited, but it shades all the incentive structure among the young people, venture capitalists, and everything, because they see that possible most secure way of life versus the risk if they fail. So they can't even take any step towards that risk, which can sometimes turn into massive success, but because of the chances, then they don't. While the American system, where a lot of these startups, they kind of wear these failures as like the Medal of Honor, because they failed 10 times, but they succeeded big in their 11th time, which hardly ever happened in Japan. So I wonder if there's any way that incentive structure can be revised to make that risk to be a part of corporate culture, corporate system, incentive system in Japan.
Do you want to ask anyone in particular?
Yeah, and
or?
I don't know if Abenomics reform had that part consciously included in the system. I don't know that much about the details of it, but I would like to know if that can be addressed too.
Is Abenomics about getting people to be more risk tolerant, take risks?
Well, the essence of the corporate governance reform is to stimulate the healthy entrepreneurship. So just like Alicia mentioned, after the blast of the bubble economy, the tendency of the Japanese company is very defensive, try to be status quo. So it's much better to getting smaller and smaller. It's maintaining the status quo is much better than the losing everything. But at the same time, after 20 years now, there may be some opportunities to grow, but they are very sort of defensive. Therefore, I would like to stimulate those sort of animal spirits, what the Keane said, or the entrepreneurship. That is the one thing. But when it comes to the labor market, I personally think the Japanese labor market is in the process of reform itself. Because all those share of the part-time jobs getting bigger and bigger, and from the positive side, it is a flexibility of the Japanese labor market. But from the sort of socialist policies point of view, it's a more sort of less stable, and it's growing income inequality. But so we have to maintain this certain balance between the flexibility and stability, and also profitability, and also the self-dignity. So I don't have the answer here yet. But we're relying on all those individual companies to maximize their profit. But I just mentioned stakeholders, not just shareholders. Stakeholders includes all those people who are working for that company. So it's maximizing the corporate value includes those things. So I think each individual company will be seeking the sort of right answer for that.
Any other thoughts, Curtis? Or?
Well, I would just add to that, at the individual company level, that really is the role of the board and the independent directors to set the incentive structure to promote healthy risk-taking. That doesn't answer the larger, I think you're asking a larger question about society, but at least at the firm level, that is really the role for the board, and where independent directors and outside institutional investors can play a big role in Japan, I think.
Yeah, since Matt was indiscreet enough to mention that I used to work for investment banks, one of the really difficult things to understand when I was an equity analyst for many years, is the attitude of Japanese investors who were not paid, to take risks. They got paid the same no matter what their performance was of their portfolio, and that in fact the pension management department of most Japanese corporates are where you just ended up for 2 years and you were rotated out before you got a chance to learn the ropes, which is another problem, the rotation system. But on your point about small companies, I'm glad I'm sitting next to this man, because I always understood, I've read, I haven't pretended to understand this, but that it's a bankruptcy issue as well, that the bankruptcy structure, the system of bankruptcies is not so easy to go through and come out again and step up. You know, it's funny when you talk about people who lost a lot and then finally succeeded after 7 times. When I lived in Japan and, you know, talking about maybe like 20 years ago, the example I would always give was Donald Trump. I think I'd try to find a new example if I were there now.
Yeah, okay. We won't get into that, although it's tempting. It's tempting. Yes, sir. The mic's coming.
Thank you. Afternoon. Nils Bild, CSIS Japan. Having suffered through or enjoyed a 12-year frustrating stint in Tokyo, if the panel could address females in the workforce.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't hold out any hope either, but okay. And then back to what the previous question, obviously bankruptcy law and the inefficiencies and basically the impossibility of getting out from under debt if you're a entrepreneur. And then perhaps some areas where you could see possible productivity gains in terms of productivity or labor output per hour or per employee. Thank you.
Okay, so on womenomics, I'll ask Alicia, since you snorted, why you snorted, and then Yamanouchi-san, you know, how does womenomics fit into this story about corporate governance? Go ahead, Alicia.
Okay, me. I'm sorry I snorted. I snort on this topic in America as well. Part of my problem that I have with it, particularly as it relates to America, is you know, when this discussion happens, it's usually talking about why can't I move from being an MD to a CEO, and it has very little to do with the lives of ordinary women. I think in Japan, actually, it's a much healthier debate because it is about ordinary women and how do you get women from, you know, living on the poverty level of single mothers or, you know, being at home and needing more money even though your husband's a breadwinner as well. How you get those people into the workforce, and you know, there are the obvious things, you know, more child care, more early education, and this to me is very puzzling. I mean, Abe himself has indicated this is a top priority for him, and he obviously has more political power than any other prime minister since probably before Koizumi. I don't understand why he just can't do it. So I think actually the prospects in Japan, once you get some of these issues, like there's a marriage tax that's just very prohibitive, once you get these issues solved, the supply of qualified women in Japan is not the issue. It's not the issue. You need to have more men step up and take greater responsibility in the household. I remember reading a survey last year in IMF that, you know, of the sort of 30 most developed countries, biggest economies in the world, Japanese men do the least number of hours of housework per week than any other country. So you need that to change as well.
But in terms of, apart from so there are the issues about womenomics itself, but in the corporate governance context, no, I mean, that was all useful, but what is the value in the context of what we've been talking about of having, do women take more risks than men? Is that why we should get more women?
I think it has to do with diversity, and it's not just women, it should be foreigners as well. There are some big Japanese companies that have put foreigners on, have invited foreigners as independent directors. But clearly, if you have a group of people who have worked together throughout their whole lives in the same company, they're not going to be as able to bring fresh perspectives and fresh questions as people who are not in that universe. And so whether it's women, whether it's foreigners, whether it's robots, I have no idea. But there are, the Prime Minister has set goals for women in managerial positions, and the new index, the Nikkei 400, also includes that as one of the standards. So, you know, if they can solve some of these mechanical problems, like the taxes, like childcare, like early education, I'm rather hopeful.
Okay.
So just quickly, two points about womenomics. And first, I think womenomics is making great progress. For example, one statistics about the participation ratio by the female labor in US and in Japan, that as of last year, the Japanese participation ratio for women was 64%. But here in the United States, 63%. So in that sense, this womenomics is working. The quality of the labor is a different question. So the management ratio is much lower. So the Prime Minister sets a sort of the goal, like 30% of the management should be female by 2020. That is a very ambitious goal, but I think the things are moving ahead, and I think we're making progress for that. And the sort of connection between the womenomics and the corporate governance reform is, one interesting thing is that now the companies are required to open the information about who are the board of directors and who are female and all those the index. And the investors are taking a look at those things. And I agree with you. The problem or challenge of this board of directors is how we could incorporate the new perspective, fresh perspective, different angle when they make a decision. The women's participation is clearly have a positive impact to that. And the investors see those sort of index of how many sort of management of women in this company, and the company gets a new investment. Through those windows, this womenomics will be fulfilled. And at the same time, the companies are getting into more to change. So I think this is a kind of a positive linkage between the womenomics and corporate governance reform.
Okay, thanks. We have done events on womenomics, and we'll do more, so we need to, there's a lot more to talk about on that topic. But Curtis, without inviting, I'm sure you could give hours lectures on the bankruptcy law. I don't want to get too much in the weeds on that, since there was a question about it, though. How does that fit into this in sort of, in 2 minutes, layman's terms?
I mean, a very short response, I think, is that, sure, there are rigidities in the Japanese legal system. There are rigidities in any legal system. I don't think most of these are legal issues. I think the speaker before who pointed to the, going back to the labor system, going back to the fundamental incentive system of society of seeking a career in a, in a large firm, making it into the management track, as opposed to a much riskier career in a startup, et cetera. I don't think that's mainly a legal issue. I think that's the incentive structure, kind of path dependence, the way Japanese society has developed, and in some sense, that makes it a much more challenging issue, because you're talking about social change as opposed to legal change.
Okay, interesting. Other questions? There's a lady there, Robin, and then a gentleman in the back after that. And we're coming up on the hour, but I'm going to go a few minutes over just to allow.
Robin White, retired Foreign Service officer, and thank you to Matt and Yamanouchi-san for those memories of 3 a.m. at the Foreign Ministry working on SII. I was doing retail distribution. My question relates to banks. My understanding is Japan has always had a system where corporations are more likely to go to banks for financing than to the stock market. That may be changing. But right now, on top of the other forms of risk aversion, banks are worried about reserve requirements, and I understand they're sitting on trillions that might otherwise be going to more productive use. So how does corporate governance relate to that? Are banks acting any differently from manufacturing or other service industries?
I'll tell you what, well, let's take the other question. If there's any other question, we'll take a third one. So if there's one more person, please let us know. And then on that question also, I think our next panel has a couple of people who will be able to help answer that question, but go ahead.
Tobias Harris, Teneo Intelligence. Just as part of this whole reform package, GPIF reform was sold as kind of sort of the stick to go with the carrot, that you're going to have a new code, and then you're going to reform the GPIF, and they're going to invest more in stocks, and they're going to follow the stewardship code and push companies. And yet that reform process has kind of gotten stalled halfway. So I was wondering if you could talk about, is there any sense that that's going to move forward? Has it had any effect thus far? I mean, obviously we know that they've shifted their portfolio and equities a lot. So you have, the GPIF now has a voice maybe that it didn't have before. I mean, what sort of impact have we seen so far? What might we see down the road as a result of that portfolio balancing?
GPIF reform. Okay, and any other? Yes. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark Mannion with the Congressional Research Service. Have you observed any changes, any excitement among outside investors, in these reforms? And then second question, The word Toshiba hasn't come up. So can you talk about your reading of the Toshiba accounting scandal and what this says or doesn't say about corporate governance and the reform effort?
Okay, so just on the outside investor thing, by the way, we invited CalPERS, CalSTRS, and the Washington State Investment Board, their chief corporate governance officers, by the way, all three of whom were women, to participate. They all wanted to participate but couldn't for scheduling reasons. So I'm sorry we don't have a buy-side person who can actually help with concrete. Yeah, you're a buy-side person. That's true. But I mean, somebody who today is actually, looking at these reforms and making their decisions about investing. But okay, so we've got a bank finance risk aversion question, GPIF reform, outside investors' reactions, and whoever wants to take on Toshiba. So any or all of that? Why don't we come back down the row and start with
Yeah,
Lucia?
I'm happy to speak to the issue about, by outside investors, I suppose you mean, foreign investors. This is actually, I think, a risk and something that I worry about a lot. Because for some reason, foreign investors are quick to read a headline in the Nikkei and say, oh, it's going to happen tomorrow. And there's this huge pile of money that comes in. When I was a bank analyst during the banking crisis, there would be a headline in Nikkei saying, oh, the bad debt problem is over. And there'd be this wave come in, and 2 weeks later, when people would realize that nothing much had changed, it would come back out again. And I think the reaction to corporate governance reforms has been way too optimistic. It's either been way too optimistic or way too cynical. I'll tell you what I mean in a minute. But I think that, when I speak to, I work for a hedge fund during the day, and when I speak to other investors who got so excited about corporate governance, were ready to pile in, there are a couple of BlackRock and others who were famous for this. You say, wait a minute. Think about this. In this country, our biggest problem has been health care, right? Everybody would say that. And we finally elect a president who says he's going to do something about it. He even passes a law. Does that mean it's all over? Of course not. It's only beginning. And I don't understand why foreign investors treat Japan differently, why they think that one headline means it's all done. So my concern is that foreign investors have jumped in. The stock market has doubled since this discussion began. And if, as we have expressed some skepticism here, if it peters out, then that money will come right back out again. And so you see this wave of foreign money come in and out, and since it's the major player at the margin, it drives prices like crazy. They also may be cynical, because again, it's widely appreciated, first of all, that GPF was going to be a big buyer. Now that Bank of Japan, Japan Post, other pension funds will also be forced buyers. I think there are a number of foreigners who are just figuring that they'll ride that coattail, they'll ride that train.
Do you want to address the question about GPIF?
The banking question, I can dismiss really quickly. It's a new day. The old-style Japanese banking system is all but dead. That is to say, the relationship banking, the cross-shareholding, which Yamanouchi-san, I think, mentioned, has disappeared. So banks, in a sense, have too much money. They haven't really acquired the skill set yet to lend on anything other than collateral. So there's that kind of wall that's preventing them from investing more money. But big companies would rather issue equity or fixed income instruments if they have to. Now they're earning so much money that they don't have to. But the banking system here is, if it is an impediment, it is an impediment to small companies. They have, by the way, jumped big time into the mortgage market, which is a new market for them. So they're finding an outlet for their cash reserves in the home financing market.
Interesting. Curtis?
I'll say a word or two about Toshiba. Not just Toshiba, of course, Olympus, Takata. You've had a series of either accounting scandals or serious product market scandals. I think the common element is a difficulty in delivering bad news up to the board, and the weaknesses in the auditing structure. So here's where I think independent directors certainly can add value and improve Japanese corporate governance. But again, just repeating an earlier point, I don't think just adding one or two independent directors per se is going to address that problem. You need a critical mass of truly independent directors acting as a committee who actually have the ability to deliver bad news to management. But at least I think this is an improvement. I think here's where independent directors really can play a role in improving Japanese corporate governance.
Okay.
Good point. 2 points. One is the role of the independent directors. And probably the first, it started as a gesture. Okay, we need one just outsiders. But recently, I think it is getting a real things. If we see the companies who have more than 2 independent directors, the ratio in 2013 was only 18%. But last year, it goes up to 48%. Means if the only one outsider would be very isolated. It's very difficult to express his own views. But if there are 2 or 3, it's a different story. So I think that this reform of the board members have already started, and it's making progress. And the other thing is, it is way too early to mention the effect of this corporate governance reform. It's only started 6 months ago. But still, already we see some changes. Because some of the leading Japanese company announced that the company will seek the ROE more than 10%. The average is now 8.5%. But why they are making that kind of statement about double-digit ROE? Because they know that will acquire the additional investment. And I think that this change has already taken place and to influence over the decision-making of the leading companies.
Great. Well, there's a lot more there, a lot more questions I have, but I think there's a lot of good insight there, and I really appreciate that, all of your contributions, which were fantastic, and I hope you will continue to help us understand these issues, and we'd like to have you back to discuss them further. Could you please join me in thanking our panelists?